I'm John Campbell, a professor in the philosophy department here, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Howison lecture. And can I say, it's just thrilling to be at an in real life lecture. It's so amazingly invigorating to have real people instead of boxes on a screen there. So hello, I'm glad you could all come. Today's lecture commemorates George Holmes Howison. Howison came to Berkeley in 1884 when he was 50, and he founded the philosophy department here. He was evidently a charismatic and much-loved individual with rumbustious philosophical views, which he developed with a great deal of force and exuberance. On his death, his many friends put together a fund, which is what's paying for today's lecture, in order to attract the most significant and influential thinkers of the day out here to the rural wilderness of California. So we're particularly delighted to have Stephen Yablo here today. Professor Yablo did his BSc in Maths and Philosophy at the University of Toronto, and he also spent some time at the University of Pune in India. He did his PhD in philosophy right here at the University of California, Berkeley, and he's living proof that a Berkeley education won't let you down. He went first, if I may say so, he went first to Michigan and then in '98 to MIT, where he's been to the present day. He's written dozens of sharp, incisive, original articles that have established him as one of the most reliably interesting and significant philosophers alive today. He has 3 books, Things, Thoughts, and the most recent one, Aboutness, develops a theory of the subject matter of a sentence in context. One theme of this book is that truths come to us wrapped in larger falsehoods. So often, I expect that all of us have been in this situation sometimes. Often, it will happen that you make a large claim, and then someone points out the consequences of what you said, and you say, well, I didn't mean that. I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about something else. And you want to kind of cut away the bit that wasn't what you were talking about. And that, once it's pointed out, as it hadn't really been systemically pointed out before, it's clear that that's a very important part of ordinary communication, what's going on in an ordinary conversation. But its systematic analysis is very, very difficult. And Yablo's book is, I think, so far as I know, the only, certainly the first, and to this day, I think, the only full-scale systematic attempt at giving an analysis of this important subject. His subject today is the demarcation problem in philosophy. This, in contrast, is an old problem, I think, or at any rate, by American standards, it goes back to the 1920s. So it's very old. But the problem, as he explained it, is that philosophy doesn't have a distinctive subject matter. I mean, if you're in astrophysics, you can say, I study the heavens. Biology, you can say, I study cellular organisms. But what is the subject matter in philosophy? You talk to a philosopher, you could find yourself talking about anything. So what is it that's distinctive of philosophical problems? Well, Stephen says it's their genealogy. But what's meant by genealogy, I can't wait to hear. So please join me in welcoming Professor Yablo.
Well, I'm going to be sitting because you don't want to be seeing me try to stand. It's a thrill to be here back in the place that I learned, to the extent that I did learn to be a philosopher. That was in the early 1980s, back here In Berkeley, graduate school is kind of like childhood in a lot of ways. On the one hand, it sort of seems unforgettable at the time. On the other hand, like childhood, it can be very hard to remember exactly what happened. And in some ways, what did they teach us? What was the Berkeley doctrine in those days? There was like generally a feeling that we were around, the great things were happening, even if we didn't quite know what they were. And certainly whatever was the Berkeley style of philosophy, I didn't do it when I was a grad student, and I didn't wind up practicing it out in the world, and I haven't done it in my whole life until now. Now I'm going to make sort of a probably misbegotten attempt to sort of come to terms with some of the themes that I encountered in the 1980s, which were probably dimly understood even then, and I might just be putting a nail in the coffin right now, which is this is kind of like what could have been my qualifying exam, or it could be my disqualifying exam. Much too late. Well, we'll see how that goes. Thank you very much for the opportunity. After the thanks, it's always good to move on to the apologies. There's always more of those. There's different kinds of philosophy talks. There's the usual kind is somebody sort of enunciates a thesis and then kind of gives a long argument for the thesis. And there's a second kind where somebody kind of has an idea and they run it up the flagpole to see who salutes, as they used to say in advertising speak. And then there's a third kind where somebody runs something up a flagpole to see who salutes, but then they realize they've kind of got it up so high and it's sort of foggy enough that people don't know whether to salute, and they're not even sure they could see the flagpole. And then you kind of bring it down, and people say, "Why is that thing at half mast? Did somebody die?" This will be more the third kind of talk. So I'm just going to be like throwing some stuff against the wall, whether it hangs together. If you find anything in it you understand, then you have at least that on me, and probably on the person sitting next to you. Okay, so. Let's start. So Karl Popper, a long time ago, you mentioned the 1920s. I think I don't know the whole history of this problem. But Karl Popper, a long time ago, wanted to explain what it was that separated natural science from other areas of inquiry. And the three that he mentioned, I think this is an interesting triple: logic, metaphysics, and psychoanalysis. I'm not actually sure which he had the highest esteem for of those. Scientific claims, he thought, were falsifiable, at least in principle. He said you couldn't really verify them because they had universal quantifiers in front. You can never verify that everything is a certain way, but you can falsify. It's one of those things that people say, oh, you can't prove a negative. Like, I don't know, who had that idea? You can't prove a universally quantified claim, but you can falsify a universally quantified claim by finding a single counterexample, and that's what makes scientific claims special. They're falsifiable. And this, I mean, I really should have researched this, given that I'm leading with it. But here's what I remember hearing remember hearing about this from Feyerabend or somebody in 1981. Feyerabend is probably not the go-to guy on like Popper exegesis. But anyway, that's what I remember. Anyway, but I mean, first of all, I mean, it seems wrong in both directions. It seems like you can falsify. He mentions logic as a contrast case. You can falsify logical claims if somebody says, this is unprovable. That seems like a logical claim, but giving a proof certainly seems like something you can do, and that would seem to falsify that it's the claim that it's unprovable. But more importantly, while certain scientific hypotheses, those are the forms sort of everything is A or all A's are B, are maybe falsifiable if B is the right kind of predicate by finding a counterexample. If you switch to a slightly different one, like every A will eventually be B, then it seems like you have to wait till the end of time to find out whether this A will eventually be B. And you won't, you mentioned Dummett earlier. Dummett's example of this was like, a city will never be built on this spot. It's very hard to falsify because you never know. They might eventually clean up that toxic sludge pit and build something here. Anyway. So another way you might try to characterize science or sciences is via subject matter, say what a scientific theory is about. David Lewis had the idea of analyzing subject matters. I'm going to be using the notion of possible world here as sort of a complete way things could have been. David Lewis had the idea of analyzing subject matters as sort of relations on among worlds. Sometimes people speak of logical space as the space of all possible worlds. And so the idea was that you would count worlds equivalent or similar where a subject matter is concerned if things are just alike where that subject matter is concerned. So take in the two worlds. So his favorite example was the number of stars. It's a way of kind of grouping worlds. You group them on the basis of how many stars they have. So worlds with 0 stars go into the same cell. Worlds with exactly 1 star go into the same cell, et cetera, et cetera. And so one might ask, well, can you, he allowed in principle that any way of grouping worlds constituted a subject matter, so we could say, let's have a subject matter that groups worlds together on the basis of like what kind of blows up or lets off a nasty smell if you like mix substances together, and we'll say worlds are alike if the substances sort of blow up at both or neither. When you mix them together. And that could be a very kind of primitive conception of what chemistry is. Chemistry tries to sort of enumerate, elaborate, systematize the truths about that subject matter, what blows up when. You could do a similar thing for biology, count worlds similar if they have similar types of living things operating on similar principles, and biology tries to sort of boil down the most important truths about that subject matter. For a sentence to be, I should say, about a subject matter is for its truth value to supervene on how things stand where that subject matter is concerned. So the number of stars is prime is about how many stars there are, because if you've got two worlds with equally many stars, they agree as well in whether they have primely many stars. And that's sort of an idea that applies more generally. We could say, look, biology consists of whatever it might be, the most interesting truths that never change or statements that never change in truth value between sort of biologically equivalent worlds. Of course, you'd want to have some notion of what it is for a subject matter to be tractable, because not every way of grouping worlds together is going to lend itself to an interesting sort of body of, field of inquiry where people say, let's try to get straight on this. And that may be where philosophy comes in, because philosophy is not known for its tractability. So one idea you might have is that subject matters that aren't as amenable to systematic treatment, that aren't as tractable as, say, the subject matter of biology or of chemistry. Forgive me, I mean, everything I'm saying is like, I wish it was an excuse to say if I had more time I could make this seem less simple-minded, but no amount of time would enable me to make this seem less simple-minded. So, chemists find their time is well spent. They try to get straight on the subject matter, and they find, we can get a lot of the facts down in fairly short order on the basis of these sort of principles. And that hasn't been at least my experience. I could have had a particularly bad go of it at Berkeley, where they kind of prided themselves on that kind of thing. And when you came anywhere near solving a problem, that was evidence you didn't really understand the problem, which I'm somewhat sympathetic to, actually. But so you could take the view that there's nothing in the subject matter approach intrinsically that would limit it to subject matter of this or that science. So we might ask, what about philosophy? What's the subject matter of philosophy? And the difference would be maybe that philosophy's subject matter is intractable. But even so, there would have to be something we could point to as the aspect or aspects of reality that the discipline tries to get right. I assume that not every philosophers are kind of very ecumenical and the kind of thing they'll take seriously, but mere intractability, I think, is not sufficient recommendation. Although to read a lot of journals, you'd think that might be enough. But mere intractability is not sufficient recommendation for philosophical study. So there's one problem. Only some ways of carving up logical space are proper objects of philosophical study, and it's hard to say which ones. And you might worry conversely that only some philosophical problems, this is closer to what I'm going to be talking about, correspond to ways of carving up logical space. So take the problem of determinism and free will. What would it even mean for world W to disagree with world W prime on how free will and determinism are to be reconciled, or whether they're reconcilable. You say, oh, these two worlds, it plays out exactly the same way in these two, but not in these two. It's just not clear where you would look for guidance on that. What would it mean for worlds to disagree on whether their tables are material, as in Locke, or collections of ideas, as in Berkeley? Pun not intended. Okay. There will be some intended puns coming up, so I thought I should mention that. Yeah. But these kinds of questions are premature, you might think. Just as you don't know to begin with which subject matters will turn out to be tractable, which lines of inquiry will eventually get spun off as sciences. One doesn't know to begin with which subject matters will turn out to be genuine, which lines of inquiry will come to seem sort of misguided or spurious. If the dimensions along which worlds can vary is not immediately obvious, just based on a priori reflection, maybe that's not a bug but a feature. Maybe that's sort of the discovery procedure for which questions are spurious and which aren't. So I guess got to the end of page 1. I'm already getting 5 minutes left. No one's quite said that yet, but I realize that I'm going to have to make some choices. So if there's anything you don't understand at the end, the explanation is that I wasn't given 3 hours like the last Howison lecture that I went to was Michael Dummett, who was given, I wouldn't say given, he took 3 hours. I believe he and I were the only people left in Wheeler Auditorium by the time it was done. I'm just looking through the crowd. Are you the one I'm going to be alone with? All right, okay. But that said, we should at least be open to the possibility that philosophy is not happily characterized in terms of the subject matter or subject matters that it tries to get right. This wouldn't necessarily make subject matter irrelevant to the philosophical demarcation problem, because there's a different role, I'll be arguing, that subject matter can play. And we've already hinted at this different role in saying that it's not obvious in advance which topics are worthy of study. That itself has to be studied. And this ought to remind us of a famous old paradox, sometimes called Meno's paradox, or the paradox of inquiry. If before engaging in inquiry we needed to settle on the topic of inquiry, which it seems like it would be a good idea unless you sort of go off in some crazy direction, then it seems like you'd have to be able to find the proper topic for inquiry without having first engaged in any relevant form of inquiry, which seems like it might be a difficult thing to do. So we seem to be caught in a circle. And it seems like the only way out is for at least some topics to be sort of settled in advance, the kinds of things that you know are worth looking into before you've studied much else. And you might think, well, philosophy would be a natural fit for some of those. But now there's a certain kind of tragic possibility that suggests itself, which is that we have to hit in philosophy on a topic of inquiry before we're in a position to tell whether it's really a tenable topic. We might have tied ourselves to the mast subject matter-wise in particular areas before we realize that, you can't help but contradict yourself if you're going to be sticking to this topic. You're holding yourself to, if you're going to take this kind of discussion to be answerable to how matters stand, M-wise, where N is the subject matter in question. That, to me, is going to be like that's the birth of tragedy. I try to always get European. I gather that's an important, deep philosophy book from Europe. Okay. Okay. But let's back up a bit. Generality and abstractness is a feature that's often been pointed to as a characteristic of philosophical subject matter. So Bertrand Russell seems to be speaking to the question of logic subject matter when he says that it's concerned with the real world just as truly as zoology, though with its more abstract and general features. And I hadn't realized this until just recently reading a book by Ducasse from the 1940s about the nature of philosophy. Russell cites the same abstractness and generality in characterizing philosophy at large. So Ducasse says, by way of explaining Russell, that philosophical propositions may be asserted of each individual thing much as the propositions of logic are asserted of each individual thing, they formulate properties which belong to each separate thing, not properties belonging to the whole of things collectively. Russell has used the word any for this. Anything is such and such, as opposed to all things are such and such. The properties that apply in a sort of schematic way to any possible thing you could think about. And he says, these properties are to be those that belong not only to each separate thing that exists, and this is an important wrinkle we're getting back to each that may exist. This is in a section of Ducasse's book called Philosophy is Identical to Logic. So philosophy on this view has a maximally general subject matter, attributing properties purporting to belong to everything whatsoever. Worlds are philosophically equivalent. I use this equivalent sign with a little phi for philosophy. If they agree on which f's are such that for all x, fx. You can be sure that any halfway definite sounding idea I put out there is just for purposes of almost immediate ridicule, so you don't really have to, so don't worry about trying to say, oh, that could be right. That's never a good thought. But you might think, can't one always dream up for two worlds, W and W prime, an artificial enough F such that worlds differ on whether everything of that world is F, so let F be the property of, there's coexists with over 1 million dogs. You're then going to, worlds such that everything is F and that lack that property are basically going to be worlds with over 1 million dogs versus that don't have 1 million. Philosophers aren't interested in the difference between worlds with 1 million dogs and worlds with fewer or more. So you might think, look, maybe that just shows that some kind of naturalness restriction will be needed on this predicate F. Well, what is it for a natural feature F to hold universally? Well, that might sound like it could be a natural law, like nothing moves faster than the speed of light. But it doesn't seem to make worlds, first of all, that's not a plausible theory of natural laws at all. And second, it doesn't really make worlds philosophically different if they differ in their natural laws. That would make philosophy too much like science, and it's not supposed to be like science. At least around Berkeley, it's not supposed to be like science. Worse, it could hold accidentally in a world that nothing moves faster than the speed of light. And so you'd have two worlds, or even at a much lower speed. It could be that accidentally nothing goes more than 100 miles an hour, but you don't want to distinguish two worlds, certainly not on philosophical grounds, on the basis of whether anyone is speeding or not. Yeah. Okay. Well, what if we broaden the quantifiers, as Russell suggests, to cover each thing that may exist? Worlds would be philosophically unalike on this view, and they differed on whether necessarily everything is F. But if differing on whether everything is F was too easy, without severe constraints on F, any two worlds are going to differ on whether everything is F for some badly enough chosen F. Now it's going to be too difficult for worlds to differ in this respect, because necessity claims hold, so it's often thought, and all worlds are in none. So you're not going to get two worlds W and W prime, and one of them necessarily everything is F, and the next world over, it's not the case that necessarily everything is F. Again, one could try to spin. This is me trying to win approval from my former Berkeleyan overlords who talk this way. So one could try to spin this as a success. What philosophers are trying to talk about runs too deep to be represented. The subject matters we're trying to talk about, they're supposed to distinguish worlds, but in fact they're so deep that all the worlds are alike with respect to the matter in question. It's the kind of thing that has to be shown rather than said. Mysticism and logic make rather strange bedfellows, you might think, but around the time that people were speaking of showing versus saying, they often appeared together in the titles of books and papers. Russell has a paper called Mysticism and Logic. Walter Stace has a chapter in his book about the nature of philosophy on mysticism and logic. Wittgenstein, of course, in the Tractatus, links mysticism with logic. part of the reason that the two are grouped together might be that both, on the one hand, claim to be profoundly informative, more informative than anything else, and both double down on that claim when it's pointed out that it's very difficult to point out a subject matter that they're both profoundly informative about. It's sort of like, it's your fault, you people in love with old-fashioned ideas of subject matter. We're higher than subject matter. Okay, words and things. So Russell contrasts the worldly approach with that of what he calls the linguistic philosophy, which cares only about language and not about the world. He gives a slightly bizarre analogy to bring out this contrast. He said he used to have a clock when he was a kid and had a pendulum. He found out went much faster if he took the pendulum out. Of course, it didn't tell the time, but it went satisfyingly quickly. And he thought that was really, really cool. And so he said, linguistic philosophy, this is Russell, the boy who preferred the clock without the pendulum, because although it no longer told the time, it went more easily than before and at a more exhilarating pace. I don't know, but this seems to pick up on a passage from Austin. So Austin said, we need to prize words off the world to hold them apart from it. But if that's where Russell got this idea, he's got Austin almost completely wrong, because the point of prizing words off the world for Austin is, quote, to realize their inadequacies and arbitrariness. So it would be a scandal if words would be arbitrary. But it seems like it's a problem even for Austin. I remember one story that Grace used to tell, this was graduate student days, about there used to be this discussion group, or lunch club, where they would talk about like philosophically deep topics, which Austin would immediately try to deflate by coming up with the most superficial possible example. And so at one time I was actually going to use this, but you didn't use the word pleasure. You didn't say it gives me great pleasure to introduce the following speaker, but that was the suggestion that Austin made. There would be a useful example for a session on pleasure. What is the nature of pleasure? He says, yes, as in it gives me great pleasure to introduce the following speaker. And I don't know if Grace made this up, but he suggested that for a week when they were going to talk about religious faith, that he said, yes, as in yours faithfully, at the end of it. Yeah. Anyway. But anyway, Austin's idea is we try to realize the inadequacies and arbitrariness of ordinary words, after which, he says, we're to, quote, relook at the world without blinkers, which is somewhat, it's not a very Austin-like thing to say. And then he says, when we worry about what we should say when, we are looking not merely at words, but also at the realities which we use the words to talk about. We are using a sharpened awareness of words to sharpen our perception of, though not as the final arbiter of, the phenomena. This is not the Austin we remember or care to remember. So a better term Austin suggests for this kind of philosophy that he's interested in is linguistic phenomenology, which is a phrase that Ryle also used with Ware Wright, because he was actually interested in phenomenology, which I don't think Austin was. But phenomenologists study representational devices with a view to their purport for the kind of world beyond. So they want to know what is imagination like, because they want to know, well, what is it purporting to tell us about the larger world. So Russell's picture of linguistic philosophers as caring about language and not the world is way off the mark. They care about both. In fact, a fantastic example of linguistic phenomenology, here I'm really throwing time consciousness to the wind here, so I've got, is Russell himself gives this great example. He says when we think about like the identity of like, is Scott the author of Waverley? He says, you always tempted to think of it as, are these things identical? Here's one thing, Scott, and here's this other thing, the author of Waverley. So you've got these two things, and are they identical? And he says, of course that's nonsense, but that's the way. He says, that's obviously absurd, but that is the sort of way one is always tempted to deal with identity. And Mark Crimmins has a wonderful paper on identity where he suggests that at a certain level that is what you're doing cognitively, that you sort of imagine things apart and you treat identity as though it was a promiscuous relation that it could obtain between distinct things. But it is interesting, and many philosophers have pointed this out, that if someone says, I wonder if Hesperus is phosphorus, you say, oh, that's stupid. You're wondering if a thing's itself? He says, no, I'm talking about two things, Hesperus and phosphorus. If you don't get that, you haven't even started on this topic. It's two things. We're wondering if they're identical. And there's a whole history of ordinary language papers with titles like "A Curious Plural." It's like wondering how we get away with using the word "they" in connection with identity. Okay, knowing what you're talking about. So having no idea what you're studying or talking about in a field of inquiry certainly looks like an obstacle to making progress on it. It hasn't turned out that way for me, actually, but I don't know. Your mileage may vary. But didn't Russell rely on his work in philosophy, particularly his work in logic, on a view of what he was talking about? That is actually not so clear. He goes back and forth on this quite a bit. Well, maybe, yeah, without seemingly realizing it. He says some of the time, as I just mentioned, that logic is about the world and its abstract and general features. Elsewhere, though, he says of pure mathematics, which for him is a branch of logic, that it has no distinctive subject matter at all, and he goes on and on and on about what's really going on. I won't read the whole quote, but he has this wonderful thing at the end where he says, mathematics may be defined as the subject in which we never know what we are talking about, nor whether what we are saying is true, which already is sort of ambitious enough. But then he says, I love this, it's on the side, people who have been puzzled by the beginnings of mathematics will, I hope, find comfort in this definition and will probably agree that it is accurate. That's right, yeah. He did not lack for self-confidence. Okay. So it's beginning to seem, based on this absurdly limited survey of like attempts to find things for philosophy to be about, even looking at particular areas like logic, it's not easy to say what those things are that philosophy aims to be getting right. Maybe we were too quick to assume that subject matter blindness gets in the way of doing philosophy or making philosophical progress. It doesn't seem to have gotten Russell's way. Certainly, if a guiding subject matter for a field is a subject matter you have to sort of get in place before you can make progress, as opposed to the kind of thing you can be constantly rethinking, the Neurath's boat, in the Neurath's boat way, the boat that you're rebuilding at sea while remaining afloat in it, it's not clear philosophy has a guiding subject matter. Well, does it have a subject matter at all, even a non-guiding one? Well, is there something of which philosophy aims to give an accurate account? Bernard Williams, for one, is wary of this idea. One of his worries harks back to something like Russell's distinction between abstract, general, necessary features and particular local contingent ones. The distinction that Williams famously focuses on is between what he calls absolute features of reality and parochial features of reality. Both are, in a good sense, really there, but parochial features figure mainly in our conception of the world and that of like-minded creatures or similarly socialized creatures. We would not expect them to turn up in the worldview of creatures with different sensory or cognitive endowments, different sympathies or different living arrangements. Parochial features drop out as we abstract away from these idiosyncrasies, and we are left eventually with a world as it presents itself to God or to a God's eye perspective. The features, here's the intended pun. The features visible from this God's eye perspective are the ones he calls absolute. It seems a little bit funny when you're trying to get. No, I mean, I think there's something very, very deep there, but that's not my job to convince you of that. I just say things with a deep tone of voice, and you say, oh, that must be deep. Okay. Now, philosophy, as befits the majesty of the enterprise, starts out thinking that it's trying to get absolute features of reality right, as opposed to parochial ones that reflect just the way we happen to do things. Philip Pettit has a nice old paper where he talks about, I don't have no first-hand knowledge of this, you probably do. There was like a distinction in the Sloan set that Lady Diana came from between things that are Q and things that aren't Q. Q is a special way of being really cool that's like highly culturally specific. You pretty much have to be like from a very small group to really get what it is to be Q or not Q. Philosophers don't, well, Philip Pettit did worry about what was to be Q, but philosophers don't generally worry. Once it becomes clear that a feature depends on like highly specific, unlikely to be repeated social arrangements, a lot of philosophers lose interest. Not necessarily Williams and not necessarily me, but well, that's what we're getting to. So it starts out we start out thinking as philosophers, you want to get the absolute features right. On the one hand, that seems awfully grand. On the other hand, it doesn't seem grand enough because you might think the absolute features are the ones that scientists are trying to get right. They're the ones that say, don't worry so much about color, worry more about mass and charge and so on and so forth. Williams says, it is hard to deny that the idea of getting it right, which has gone into the self-image of analytic philosophy, is one drawn from the natural sciences, and that the effects of this can be unhappy. The absolute perspective, he says, even if we could achieve it, would not be particularly serviceable to us for many of our purposes, such as making sense of our intellectual or other activities, or indeed getting on with most of those activities. For those purposes, we need concepts and explanations which are rooted in our more local practices, our culture, and our history, and these cannot be replaced by concepts which we might share with very different investigators of the world. So is Williams saying goodbye here to the kind of grand scale, abstract, necessitarian, pretentious philosophy that we got from Russell? Well, yes, but in a deeper way, no. Necessity need not always be something that we expect to find out in the world as we sort of conduct like a large-scale, very general survey of the world. It could be something that we, and need for Hume and many other, Kant and many other philosophers, it's something that we bump up against in ourselves as we encounter our own limitations when we're conducting that survey. The way Williams puts it is, various of our ideas and procedures can seem to be such that we cannot get beyond them, that there is no conceivable alternative. There is no alternative seemingly to predicating features of things, or tracing objects through space and time, or seeing the world as colored or shot through with causal relations, or wondering what would have happened if so-and-so. We don't think, that's getting old. Let's just give up on that. Yeah. I mean, I say we don't think that. I mean, there are, very famous metaphysicians around who do think that this, questions of what would have happened in so-and-so are, parochial and don't really go sufficiently deep. Probably half of you know who I mean and won't take it as an insult, and the other one, I can't tell you who I mean because then you might interpret it as an insult. But not everybody thinks modality goes very deep. Okay. So certain ways of thinking force themselves on us, not because the world kind of cries out to be conceived in those ways on pain of being misunderstood, but because just that's how we roll, maybe in a very deep way because of our physiological endowment or because of deep facts about our culture. We can't help but see external objects as colored or valuable. We can't help but look for patterns and read significance into them. We can't help but form expectations about the future and wonder why things went this way rather than that, and what's a fair distribution of goods. Part of Williams' point is that philosophy wants to get this stuff right, too. Even if certain questions are forced on us more by cognitive social constraints, by how we're put together than by the world, that isn't a reason to despise them. Quine has a wonderful sentence puts this in a beautifully simple way. He says, to call something a posit is not to patronize it. It doesn't make them philosophically uninteresting. But Williams is making a deeper point, too. The capacity to operate in natural-seeming ways is mostly a blessing. A regress would threaten if every procedure that we engaged in had to be evaluated on the basis of some other more basic procedure. But it's also a curse, because if a procedure gets us in trouble, but it also, we see no real alternative to it, it's not clear how we're to get ourselves out of the trouble, because we've got nowhere else to look. And the curse and blessing aspects go hand in hand. The scripts that make life possible in their ordinary application cause trouble when taken too far. So ordinarily, it makes sense to ask why and to seek causes. Otherwise, if something unexpected happens, you say, oh, that was one of the uncaused ones. Why are you getting into a sweat about it? But again, you can take it too far. As Kant pointed out, you shouldn't keep on pressing the issue of what caused it about the whole history of the world, understood to embrace all the possible causes. Ordinarily, it makes sense not to scoff at possible sources of error. Taken too far, though, this leads to skepticism and ultimately madness. Here's an example, a much more recent example from Sarah Moss. Wondering what would have happened if we'd chosen differently is good policy on the whole. That's how you change your sort of ways of behaving. But we continue to do it even when there's no possible answer, not even a knowable answer, and we know that this is the case. So if you offer me a bet based on the outcome of an deterministic coin toss, and I don't take the bet for some reason, but I can't help wondering, would I be rich? Because I always pick tails. So I wonder, would the coin have come up tails? Well, if you think about it, if you set things up right, there's no answer to would it have come up tails. There's not even a definite way you would have tossed the coin. And if you specify it's indeterministic, there's just no answer to whether a chance event would have come out this way as opposed to the other. Still, it's a dumb question, but you really can't help but wonder if the coin would have come up tails. Sarah gives this example. I doubt this coin would land heads each time if I were to flip it 1 million times. I doubt that too. But of course, you never know for sure until you try. So I know what do you think? What is the thought there? It's very hard to think. It's a very natural thought. Since we didn't do it, well, it's a fugitive fact forever. Whether it would have come up 1 million times in a row, it's sort of like. As space expands, there's certain things that are moving away too quickly for light to make it back to it. If we didn't look in time, we would have looked in time, we would have maybe been able to see that phenomenon, but now it's too late, so we'll never know. So okay. Now we're getting closer to the kind of philosophy that, isn't or is not primarily about getting things right. So a lot of philosophical problems go like this. On the one hand, we can't help but think that X, and yet X cannot be maintained in full generality, at least not together with Y, which seems just as compulsory. Kripke, I like to think, is hinting at this kind of perplexity when he gave his recent book of collected papers the title, Philosophical Troubles. It's sort of, you get into these kind of jams. The form of interesting philosophy oftentimes, isn't philosophical finding. I mean, there are very few philosophical books, like My Philosophical Discoveries. That wouldn't sell very well. Philosophical troubles, yeah, you get into various kinds of jams. You get yourself into uncomfortable corners when you're a philosopher. And of course, this idea goes back to Wittgenstein and much earlier. The kind of philosophy that grapples with basic predicaments is not the whole of our field, but it seems in many ways the oldest and the deepest. And this is a great benefit. Davidson used to always say, we won't run out of problems very soon. This is a great thing. Like the further he was into a solution, he'd say, oh, great, we're not going to run out of problems. The great thing about sort of predicament-based philosophy is that you can count on it always to be there. Our predicaments, almost by definition, remain as the special sciences are spun off. One could call this kind of philosophy the perennial philosophy, if that name were not already taken. For what I don't know, but I know there's a book by T.H. Huxley with it, titled The Perennial Philosophy. And then I was going to call it problematic philosophy, but that title is also already taken by Bergson, apparently. Okay. See how I'm mentioning various people from the other side of the ocean? That's a very Berkeley thing to do. Okay. So grappling with the predicament need not always be a matter of dissolving it or fighting free of it. The first step is oftentimes gaining some kind of perspective on how it arises. How did we get into this jam? Leonard Cohen has a line in one of his songs that captures this perfectly. He says, I've been where you're hanging. I think I can see how you're pinned. That seems to me a very philosophical thought. Hermeneutic philosophy, I'd love a better name. I'm sure there pretty much has to be one, is the kind that offers to hold us up before the mirror so that we can see how we're pinned. The possibility or desirability of getting unpinned can then be left as a further question, and it might well turn out, for reasons we'll discuss, that getting unpinned would be even worse. So a philosophical intervention has two main parts on this proposal. Philosopher first presents us with a model of how someone could wind up in a certain sort of jam or perplexity. Subject matter has a role to play here. That's what we're going to get to. Then we're invited to consider whether we ourselves might not be in this very jammed up position. So this distinction that I'm getting at between illustrating how someone could get jammed up, and then invitation to ask yourself, to wonder, might not you be jammed up in that exact way? Is illustrated by an Old Testament parable about King David. King David, I guess, was God's favorite. I hadn't realized this entirely until I read around. All these things. I think somewhere it says he's a man after my own heart or something like that. Some incredibly banal thing. He liked King David a lot. Except he did, and there's a Leonard Cohen song, Hallelujah. I heard there was a secret chord that David played and it pleased the Lord. If you do a search, David pleased the Lord, I think 62 times. But I want to talk about this one time he didn't please the Lord. He really pissed the Lord off. And this was the story of David and Bathsheba. He obtained Bathsheba as his umpteenth lover by the device, in part, of getting her husband killed in battle unnecessarily. Properly displeased, the Lord sent down a moral instructor with the unlikely name of Nathan to teach David a lesson. So Nathan came down and he said this he says, David, there were two men, one rich and one poor. The first had a very large flock. The poor man had only one wee little ewe lamb. I think I just made up the wee because it comes from you. One day a hungry traveler came to the rich man, but he was loath to take anything from his own flocks to prepare a meal for the guest. So he took the poor man's one little lamb, which he treated like a child. The Bible goes on and on about how much this guy loved his little ewe lamb. When David heard this, he flew into a rage. The one who did this deserves to die. He shall pay 4 times over because he did such a thing and he showed no pity. And Nathan said to David, thou art the man. This was a parable to illustrate what David himself had done. You can connect the dots. It actually took me a surprisingly long time to connect the dots, but you could see that. Yeah, he who already has much, more should not be given to he who already has much, and he certainly should not be taking more, although that seems to be the way increasingly. So Nathan helps David to see how he's sinned, not how he's pinned, but the basic idea is the same. The philosopher starts by telling a story. The philosopher invites us to try it on for size, pointing out that we would be confused in much the same way that we are confused if things had played out as in the story. I'm going to try to tell that kind of story. Subject matter has a crucial role to play in it. So I think maybe I should just sort of skip a bunch of okay, I'm going to do the next section, directed truth. So Nelson Goodman, in a lovely paper called Truth About Jones, made an important point about truth-telling, that someone's testimony is, 1, false, and 2, about a certain individual, Jones, does not mean that the testimony was false about Jones. It could be that the false bit's all concerning this other guy, Smith. He was exactly right about Jones, so his testimony is false. It's about Jones, but it wasn't false about Jones. This actually came from some stuff of Davidson's about the logic of adverbs. You can you can sing a certain song, and you can do it badly without singing that song badly, because what you did that was bad was something that didn't have to do with your rendering of the song, but you stood too far from the mic or something like that. Yeah. Okay. So the great thing about directed truth about a certain subject matter, like Jones, from a hermeneutic perspective, is that it lets us tell, in some cases, a story about how we're pinned. How does it come about that we see no alternative to these statements A, B, and C when we know full well that they can't be true together? Well, maybe it goes like this. A, B, and C are supposed to be about a certain subject matter, M. That's their intended topic. That's what they're supposed to address themselves to. They are all true about that subject matter, maybe even analytically so. Truth about that subject matter suffices, if they're genuinely about M, for truth. So you can be forgiven for thinking that statements are true if you're duty-bound to regard them as about a certain subject matter about which they're true. And what happened is, unbeknownst to you, they kind of got away from what the subject matter that was assigned to them, which is bound to happen if you don't have this godlike power that we sometimes grant ourselves of deciding what we're going to be talking about in advance. So this kind of story, if you can tell, it does not unpin us. We still can see no good alternative to these statements A through C. But it shows that our predicament is not just an unforced error. So people used to sometimes make fun of Berkeley philosophy by saying it's like a series of unforced error, which seemed to me, even in the bad old days when I was here, it's a series of forced errors. It's not unforced errors. Philosophical problems are sometimes, at least, like blind spots, reflective of a system that's basically working as it should. This is how a system that's working properly, it will have this exact defect. It would not be good for our visual systems overall to try to get rid of our blind spots. When you think about how the eye works, you'll be able to see even less afterwards. Okay, so the question of why our statements can't be wholly about their intended subject matter, why their truth values have to be sensitive to distinctions not contemplated by M, the assigned subject matter, is interesting. And the short answer is that the world may be unkind. It may contain unexpected situations such that the three statements cannot be true about that subject matter together, though they each can be true about it apart. This situation was not on the cards when the language was introduced and assigned a subject matter. So I'm going to skip ahead. You're not going to hear me talking about regulative ideals, which is going to be healthy for both of us. So I'm just going to go to some philosophical messes where this kind of thing arguably arises. And I'll go through maybe two of the three messes I've got down here, and then I'll conclude. So, Sorites paradoxes. So predicates like red are supposed to be applicable on the basis of casual observation. Observationality means that the look of an object decides its color, at least if your eyes are working right, with the consequence that any pair of objects indistinguishable in point of color must satisfy the condition. I'm quoting Crispin right here. That's why there's so many relative clauses and the sentence is going on longer than it should. Must satisfy the condition that any basic color predicate applicable to either is applicable to both. And he says this is a very fundamental fact about their senses, whose sacrifice would be possible only at great cost. So this gives us the crucial premises of a Sorites paradox. X is red because X is, say, a ripe tomato, and then you have a Sorites sequence of objects getting slightly closer to orange all the way down the line. You say if X is red, so is X prime. If X prime is red, so is X double prime. If Xn minus 1 is red, so is Xn. And then you have to conclude, if by modus ponens, if Xn is red. This is false because Xn is an orange. So these intermediate conditionals cannot all be right because they take us from a truth, a clear truth, to a falsehood. And the hermeneutic problem is to say why they seem so right. Do existing theories make this comprehensible? Well, and here I'm going to be even more unfair than I've been so far. So take epistemicism. Epistemicism says we can't know any of the premises to be false, given a margin for error constraint on knowledge. You can never know that X5 is red, but X6 isn't red. But I don't know about you, but the fact that I can't know something to be false really does not go very far towards explaining why I persist in insisting, despite that contradiction follows, that it must be true. There's like a lot of things that I have trouble knowing to be. I have trouble knowing it to be false that there were ever exactly an odd number of dinosaurs, but I don't say, well, therefore there must have been like exactly an odd number of dinosaurs. Supervaluationists say that, I'll skip them. Contextualists say the point that the pairs that we're attending to cannot differ in quote-unquote color, what the word color is in context sort of standing for, the word red is in context standing for. The switcheroo between the red, there has to be a switcheroo between the red and the not red things, but it's always elsewhere. It's always somewhere where that you're not looking. But do we really doubt the existence of lines that cannot be made salient? I I'm perfectly willing to grant that there are lines that, I mean, if the fact that I cannot make the line between like F and not F salient was enough to convince me that there is no such line, then it should seem salient to me that things never differ non-saliently. But I'm pretty sure I accept that things often differ non-saliently. So the idea that it's just that if you look at two things, that's not where the action is happening, that doesn't seem like a sufficient explanation of why these premises seem sort of undeniable. Well, I want to say that they seem undeniable because we feel ourselves and we mean to be talking about a subject matter that lies fully open to view. Lewis calls this subject matter observation. It groups worlds together which look the same to casual observers. Each of the premises, all of the form, like if this one is red, then that one, just like superficially indistinguishable from the original one, is also red. Those are, by definition, true about observation. And this is so because basically what it is to be true about observation or true about any subject matter is a thing is true about a subject matter in our world even if it's false in our world, it's not false because of how our world is where that subject matter is concerned. You can find another world that's just like ours, where that subject matter is concerned, where it's true. The subject matter is observation. I've got these two things that look exactly the same in color. I can certainly find a world where they really are exactly the same in color, where that looks exactly like our world. Just go to a world where they look just the same, but they really are the same in color. That's enough to show that it's true about observation, or about observational red, that if the one is red, then the other one is red. And so here's the story. It's 1 to 4 on whatever page of the handout we're on. The conditionals, in fact, address the issue of things' colors. That's the only thing that's really around for them to address. This is supposed to be the same as the issue of their observational colors. There's not supposed to be a difference between color and observational color. This is red, therefore the next one over is red, seems true because it is true about observational colors, the intended subject matter. This doesn't make it true, period, because we live in a fallen world. We left Eden. Color is not observational color. I spent a while looking around for pictures of Eden to make clear that it didn't contain any Sorites sequences. But even you'd think that would be easy because how big can a painting be? But they tend to be full of color. I wasn't even sure I could determine that there weren't any Sorites sequences in paintings of Eden. Okay. So each of the premises seems true for the best possible reason. It is true of the issue that we understandably take it to address. What is not true, even about that issue, observational color, is their conjunction. There's no single observational duplicate of our world in which adjoining color patches really stand or fall together redness-wise. You have to go to different worlds, so to speak, to witness the truth about observation in our world of each of those premises. And now the tragic aspect. If not for Sorites sequences, these sequences of objects that probably didn't exist till the industrial age, where you couldn't distinguish pairs of them. See, I'm a full-blown Luddite. I mean, I really think that was that's when things really went bad. When industrial the science of making color chips developed. That's when Sorites sequences really became inescapable. Who knew back in Eden that life would be unkind in this way? Colors clumped up nicely, and observationality seemed like a great constraint. Only later did the world begin to play tricks on us, and even now we are most often in Eden-like situations with big gaps between the reds and the oranges, lots to gain and little to lose by sticking with the original subject matter. Okay, now I'm going to skip the other two examples and just go to the very short conclusion, so there's time for questions. A little bit of time for questions. Lessons, if any. Philosophy is as much about seeing how we're pinned as about finding the truth. Aboutness sheds less light than one might have hoped on truth-seeking philosophy, but fortunately, that's not the deep Berkeley kind of philosophy, so who cares? It sheds more light than one might have thought on philosophy seeing how we're pinned aside, or at least so I'm suggesting. We get pinned because we have to tragically commit ourselves, at least with regard to very basic subject matters, to their being on a certain topic, which it turns out they can't consistently be about, but no one was in a position to know it at the time when we had to sort of settle what we were talking about. So it's because we live in a fallen world that we wind up contradicting ourselves, and we should try to make our peace with that. And oftentimes, the ways we contradict ourselves are better just like put up with, the thought is, than done away with by trying to improve a concept in a way that doesn't loses its motivational force, and that we have trouble even kind of using in a spontaneous way. Thank you very much.
So we're open for questions now, but maybe just to get the ball rolling, I could ask you a little bit about the view you're developing in the last tranche of the paper. So I guess through the middle of the 20th century, people would have said, I mean, particularly later Wittgenstein, for example, would have said, very much like you, I think, that the philosophical problems are forced on us. We find ourselves pinned, just as you say, and we can't get out of the fly bottle. That kind of language is very familiar from that kind of time. And so that's like your picture, if I'm getting it, on the insistence on the inescapability of these errors that we can't see our way out. And the diagnosis there was always, well, there's something about our language that we don't understand, that we're not finding our way about in our language properly. And then, as I understand the way the subject, that philosophy has gone in the meantime, all that stuff about language seemed to get thrown out of the window. And the idea was, no, we are going to address the world. Language is just a small part of the world. We are going to address it directly. And then there's always something a little bit mystifying about how do you do that exactly? If I understood what, I'm not sure I've understood what you were doing at the end, so this is really just to ask for clarification here. It seems like you're suggesting a picture where there are similar intractable problems. Similarly, there are these intractable problems, but they're coming up because of something about, you didn't use the word representation, but if I can, something about the representations that we're using to think about the world, where we're subject to these errors as to what the subject matter is and whether two representations have got the same subject matter or not. And it doesn't, how should I say, the vibe is quite different to a Wittgenstein vibe. We're not really talking about a natural language like English directly. We're talking about, I don't know, maybe propositions or something like that, but something that has a subject matter anyway. So it's a little bit like a linguistic approach, but there's a suggestion of something more methodical. That I mean, the whole idea of the 20th century approach was you can't see anything methodical here. You can just go case by case. But the idea is you could do something a bit more methodical. Am I getting the thrust?
Well, I just first want to say absolutely charming it is that you chose the word methodical for anything that I But no, to tell you the truth, I had not thought about it. So I was thinking of this very much in linguistic terms and in terms of, like, subject matter as a feature of linguistic representational items. But you're right that there might be a version of this where you could ask yourself whether a certain kind of perceptual system has a subject matter that it's somehow pre-committed to, and maybe committed to in a way that it's hard for it to, like, so an example that Ken Walton gives about perception that's kind of interesting is he says, even after learning relativity theory, it's very hard to work it into the content of your perceptions. You know that there's no such thing as sort of anything that's absolutely at rest. But if I say to you, okay, let's just perceive this scene just like it is, but just subtract out the absolute rest part of it. Like think of everything as just moving relative to everything else. And it's a very hard trick to pull. And so, it could be that our, I'm just saying this to sort of be cooperative. I have nothing to like support it, but it's an enticing possibility that our certain perceptual systems sort of evolved under pre-Einsteinian conditions. I think that's a fairly safe bet, and they wound up sort of over committing themselves. I mean, some stuff that you were kind of about individuals and the role that individuals play. I mean, you could well imagine that our conceptual schemes evolved at a point where it was kind of useful to have individuals sort of be part of like the fundamental structure of the universe. And if it later turned out that maybe that wasn't the best way to go, well, that ship already sailed. So you can't. So I'm very interested in that. I mean, that's an interesting possibility. I mean, there's also, I suppose in moral and normative philosophy, which I've seen from a distance on different occasions, like it could be that there's some people sometimes say this, that when you want something, unless you're experiencing it as sort of like a fetishistic want, where the thing you want has got no more to recommend it than the fact that you, for some reason, want it, you're bound to think there's something worth wanting in the object, and you're picking up something valuable about it. It seems sort of a little bit in the spirit of what this is your idea, it's not mine.
It wasn't meant to be mine. It never occurred to me till you talked. Yeah. Can I just ask you one more thing? Can you just say a bit more about the idea of subject matter and how that comes into your picture of what a philosophical problem is?
The idea is that a subject matter a subject matter considered in itself is sort of a way of dividing up worlds. Worlds are alike or different where that subject matter is concerned. The subject matter just is that way of dividing up worlds. So on the simplest version, it just is a way of partitioning all the worlds into different classes, which are the ways things can be where that subject matter is concerned. And then there's the next question is, what is it for a sentence to be about a subject matter? The answer that Lewis gave is a sentence is about a subject matter if the sentence can't vary in truth value, unless there's variation in how things are where that subject matter is concerned. That has the problem that sentences can be about, that has the problem that, say, the sentence, I'm hungry, is about the subject matter, how everything is in every possible respect. Because you divided things up so finely that that sentence can't differ in truth value without changing how something is in some possible respect. Whereas to the extent that we want to talk about the intuitive subject matters of sentences, we want not something that any old subject matter that the truth value supervenes on. We want the subject matter that the sentence is exactly about. And for me, that's something, you partition the worlds into the different ways in which that sentence can be true. So you don't, so if the sentence is, I'm hungry, you don't distinguish worlds with like 1,000,000 dogs versus more dogs, because that's got nothing to do with why it's true that I'm hungry. So that's the notion of subject matter. I kind of left some of that out, but sentential subject matter is what a sentence is exactly about, and sentences about color are supposed to be exactly about something to do with observation. Yeah, even that's maybe a bit too coarse, yeah.
I'm sorry, but just one more thing. But perhaps I picked you up wrong. But I thought that when you were talking about the diagnosis of the psoriasis, for example, that that this was something about subject matter was going to be your diagnosis of where this intractable problem seems to come from.
Right. Yeah. So there's the naive, to use a phrase that Chalmers uses, Edenic subject matter. What we thought we were talking about when living under these sort of ideal conditions where certain problems hadn't yet arisen, so we could afford to think we were talking about that. And in fact, we would still be talking about that if we hadn't run into problematic situations elsewhere. So there's the intended subject matter, which is what you want the truth value of the sentence to be at the mercy of.
Okay.
And then is there anything out there that can play that role? So with color, maybe not. And so if you're going to keep on talking that way, either you can stick with the intended subject matter, but then you're going to get stuff stuck on your shoe every now and then, and there's got to be some apologetics that goes with that sort of discourse. Yeah, okay, yeah, that did happen. They came in a bit more clearly with the stuff that I didn't talk about the liar paradox. Certain kinds of talk are supposed to be about this, and that the truth value of those sentences at the mercy of these distinctions and not those. Unfortunately, there's no consistent way of doing that because the world was unkind. So if the sentence is going to have a real subject matter in the sense that it exhausts the stuff that the truth value is sensitive to, it's going to have to go beyond anything we were prepared for. And either someone like the International Bureau of Weights and Measures or someone is going to have to develop a constituency for what this new subject matter is going to be and get everyone to be on the same page. Or more likely, we'll just keep on stumbling along the way we do. Yeah, so the distinction is between subject matter that you wanted and the subject matter, the ones that are actually available to consistently speak about. Yeah,
that's really helpful. Thank you. Okay, I think you've been wishing to ask a question.
Thank you. So it seems like another way of thinking about this is not in terms of a distinct subject matter as defined by a part of the world that we're trying to cover, but maybe based on the way that we relate to the subject matter. So at the ground, philosophy is really just a bunch of people who discuss things and call themselves philosophers and go to philosophy departments and philosophy talks. And I mean, could philosophy simply be a study of the things that we don't know how to think about yet? Like once we know or believe we know how to do something, it tends to go into a different field, a different discipline, and we get a name for it. And like there seems to be a sociological principle that if we like to talk about things we don't know how to turn into sciences, then we're almost necessarily stuck on the things.
Right, but no, that is, I was trying to play lip service to that kind of view early on. Philosophy is questions that haven't got spun off and maybe aren't eligible to be spun off into sciences, but that doesn't seem to be enough because there's no shortage of such subject matters or questions out there. Some of them are philosophically gripping and some of them aren't. And I was trying to suggest that at least one source of the grippingness is that we can't say goodbye to certain subject matters because it's sort of, that would be like saying, I hate this boat. Let's burn it and we'll be out at sea. And then eventually, hopefully, some better planks will drift by, and we'll find a way to put them together into a better boat. You've got to be adrift in something, and what better than philosophy?
Right. Thank you, Shamik.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I just wanted to. I don't know if this is on. Pick up on what you said to John right at the end there when you said, so if we wanted to resolve things in such a way that we weren't, in the case of color, in such a way that we were not stumbling over ourselves every now and then, we would, maybe leave it to some international council to decide the matter. Is that the case in all cases? Or I was wondering whether another possibility is that the absolute conception of the world in Bernard Williams phrase, could decide the matter. And the question would be how to speak in a way that reflects that. Were you explicitly wanting to rule that out, or maybe leaving it open that different problems might lead to different solutions? And
Well, I guess I wasn't thinking of those as so. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay.
like in some cases,
So,
might
right.
it be that the absolute
Yeah.
conception
Yeah.
can determine the
So
right way to go?
here's another thing I learned at Berkeley. This is like the philosophical error, is to think that just because there's the relative distinction between ways of talking and thinking that are more or less reflective of idiosyncratic aspects of our, the ways we're put together, you shouldn't try to build that up into such a thing as the perfect absence of like, since we were able, it's sort of like, since we were able to make this tower a little bit taller, let's just, postulate a maximally tall tower, whatever exactly that would be. So I guess my thought would be that, there's some kind of fetishization. There's a negative way of doing the absolute parochial distinction. There's a positive way. I don't know what Bernard Williams had in mind, but I would guess it's more the negative way. There's certain ways you could sort of improve your perspective by making it kind of less mucked up with things that we could easily transcend. But the idea of, you know what? I'm tired of transcending everything one by one. Let's just like take a long weekend. Let's transcend everything. Yeah. And so that's why you might need, at a certain point, you're going to need sort of social organizations that sort of say, you can't just hand over responsibility to the world to solve these sorts of problems for us. If you spy a chance to get yourself out of certain jams, there might be no alternative but to get a big enough group of people together and say, we'll all try to get out of the jam in that same way without supposing that we'll have got out of all possible, there'll be later jams 100 years from now. But even to get out of the present jam. So I've been interested in this stuff about like constantly attempts to sort of revise what a meter means or what a second means and so on. And there's a way in which we definitely feel we're getting a better grip on what second talk was about, but it's not because once we get away from like human sensibility, we'll see what a second really was all along. Arbitrary choices are going to have to be made, and constituencies will have to be developed for. Let's all do it that way, otherwise we'll. Right.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the relation between the points that you make in the curse and blessing section and the idea of this kind of predicament-focused conception of philosophy. So the way that you motivate the idea of these philosophical predicaments that we get ourselves into, these jams, is, if I've understood it correctly, that there are these ways that we can't help thinking about the world, and then we find that when we try to extend these ways of thinking about the world too far, we find ourselves getting into conflicts with other ways that we have of thinking about the world. But I had two related questions about that. And one is whether it's necessary for the idea of the predicaments that we get into, that we get into them because what gets us into the trouble is our own ways of thinking about the world. So in other words, could it be part of philosophy that the world itself presents us with predicaments? And then the related question has to do with the fact that I was thinking about the sentence that you have at the beginning of the curse and blessing section, where you say, certain ways of thinking force themselves on us not because the world cries out to be conceived those ways, but because that's how we roll. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about that sentence, and I was thinking, I wonder if I agree with that. I was thinking maybe some of these ways that you describe as ways that are how we roll are actually ways in which the world cries out to be conceived by us. And then I thought, that seems like, if I'm puzzled about that sentence, then it seems like I'm in a kind of philosophical puzzle. I'm in a philosophical jam, but it doesn't seem like a jam that I'm led into because of conflicts in my different ways of thinking. Because in a way, the conflict is about, well, is this even the right way to think about these ways of thinking?
I thought my message was a real downer, but yours seems even worse. But there's this phrase that some people here probably know what it means, like philosophical pessimism, like Schopenhauer or something like that. Yours seems like really, like potentially more pessimistic. Right. Well, so I'm going to throw this right back at you because so I guess I want to say there's maybe two different notions of the world that could be in play when you say, does the world throw this at us? Yeah. So it could be that you don't even have something worth calling the world that sort of repays kind of theoretical attention unless certain things have already been kind of worked over by some aspect of how we're put together, which we then sort of stand aside and say, who, me? Like I'm just dealing with the world here. And so it could be, I'm certainly willing to say that, so the following could be possible, that we have to think of the world in causal terms, why, and then blah, 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 something that, you and Kant understand, but I don't. But then having done so, we then say, oh my gosh, the world sandbagged me here. And so it's making me do these things. It's presenting these problems. But whose fault was it really? I'm inclined to blame the transcendental self. I blame the transcendental self for everything. I don't know. So I mean, you could take the view that, if it wasn't for us and the whole project of trying to represent things, everything would just take care of itself. And so it could be the kind of world that does present us with predicaments wouldn't even exist if we weren't here. I don't know. I'd already gone 3 steps deeper than I know how to go, but you're going 2 more steps.
Thanks for that. I wanted to ask about the upshot of your view, if you've thought about it. So it seems like a worry for a lot of approaches to philosophy that conceive it as less in the pursuit of truth and more as like an error-discovering type of pursuit. Run into this problem that it potentially makes philosophy come to an end a little bit sooner than we might expect. So it seems like, I'm thinking of the color case in particular, often the hard part, like the feeling that we've run into something and things have become kind of intractable, comes fairly soon. You think that you have this grip on what the colors are, and then you learn some science, and then you're puzzled. And then philosophers keep talking about what we can make of this for decades and decades and decades. Yeah. John among them. And maybe that's just a horrible mistake. But maybe there is something to that. And so, I'm curious, once we're pinned, what do we do? Is there anything else? And I also kind of wondered whether, depending on your answer to this question, there's something to be said for a bit of a cultural shift in philosophy towards maybe being more willing to back out or change your mind or start over or something like that. So,
These are some very radical ideas you're suggesting. Starting with changing your mind, I don't know where that's coming from. But no, I guess I haven't read the book, but isn't that there's this book, Everything Must Go? It's kind of about that. If philosophers weren't such babies and weren't more willing, if we were more willing to grow up, we could get past all these problems. And there's it's only because of sort of an infantile addiction to the very problematic ways of of thinking that we act all sort of scandalized by and say, oh my God, how did this happen? Yeah. So philosophy is sort of a make-work project for philosophers. I guess I think people are like way too optimistic on the possibility of, in the same way as like, you know, in political philosophy, there's this sort of debate between a certain kind of conservative and a certain kind of progressive, both probably exaggerated, but you know, a certain kind of conservative says, you progressives kind of just think you can just like go into the lab and make up some, you know, clever form of social arrangement, and then if everybody just goes to sleep tonight and then you give them the drugs, they stop caring about their children or who knows what, everything will be great in the morning. You know, and I guess I don't have that. I'm not conservative about many things, but I do have a little. I guess I think the idea that we can just sort of build up. You know, we'll just set up shop on the next island, where there aren't as many like, you know, termites or something. That's going to work. I mean, you know, Paul Churchland used to talk this way in like a long time ago in Scientific Realism and the Plasticity of Mind. We'll stop talking about colors and we'll just. Or mental states, we'll talk about sort of vectors in a 79 million dimensional neural net kind of vector representation of. Well, yeah. I mean, I assume it's not like a coincidence. It isn't because like philosophers were sort of being sticks in the mud that hasn't happened. I mean, it's just like there's certain things that. I mean, in some ways, I'd rather, you know, put it the other way around. The goal of everything isn't to find like an all-purpose way of thinking that never lets you down in every setting. That would be horrible. You want to conceptually satisfy us. You want to find ways of thinking that work in almost all settings, and not be sort of knocked off your intellectual predilections by the fact that some philosopher thought of like some stupid case that never, you know, I mean, the example that I often go back to is like this idea that people sometimes have like about twin Earth cases. You can say, oh wow, you know, we're thinking about water here, but a molecule for molecule duplicate of us is thinking about twin water over there, and oh my gosh, you know, this is like a huge challenge to ordinary ways of understanding the contents of mental state, and to fight back, we have to like carve out some super subtle notion of narrow content as like a function from context. Anyway, and sort of it seems like people are very happy taking this like thing that has never happened. Like there's this planet where people are our exact same brains as like a reason to totally redo our ways of conceiving mental states. But a thing that always happens every day, all the time, that people think of water in slightly different ways, that would already kind of maybe motivate you to not assign so much importance to narrow content. Nobody says, oh, maybe we should privilege that one. I mean, there's like a huge range of predicaments, and it's dumb. Like people who do like scientific modeling don't look for the same model for every problem that might arise. And there's certain problems that arise among normal people, and you know, we work with models that work for most purposes. And the idea that we'll come up with like a super model that God would be happy to work with in all cases, you know, that's just sort of like, why? Why would you want? Especially if you're like, your species evolved to find certain ways of thinking about things natural. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. So this question goes a little bit back to the beginning. So you were talking about like what's the subject matter of philosophy, and you talked about some problems of construing it. And I was just wondering whether a lot of the problems that you pointed out are also like problems for what's the subject matter of normative inquiry more broadly, like inquiry about, you know, what we should do or what we should think and stuff like that. Yeah, and I was just wondering what do you think about that? And yeah, I guess I'm thinking like maybe there's like an important connection also between philosophical inquiry and normative inquiry.
Yeah.
One might even think that like a big chunk of philosophical inquiry is sort of like
Yeah.
normative. It's not about like carving,
Yeah.
orienting ourselves in the logical space of all
Yeah.
possible worlds, but like, what should we do? How should we
Right.
think? Anyways.
No, that makes perfect sense. And the whole, there is a section of this that never made it in that said, look, maybe there already was a mistake, in thinking of philosophy as truth-seeking, even if, on a second go-round you can reconceive questions about what to do as questions about, like, what's the true answer to, like, should I do this or that or something. That's sort of, really, we shouldn't be talking about worlds as, things that verify or don't verify descriptive statements. So you should really be talking more generally about, choices that we might be faced with, and there's different possible answers, and who cares if there's some sort of metaphysical doodad that witnesses the difference between these, and that's fair enough, and I mean, I think there's a risk of getting like super deflationary about what the subject matter is, because subject matter is then kind of being kind of like questions. And then the subject matter of, so it's sort of like, well, what are you studying in philosophy? He says, well, what we're asking about. Well, yeah. So maybe it's too much to hope for sort of a single field of play in which you can sort of like against which you can calibrate what different parts of philosophy are about, because they do seem sometimes to sort of take in each other's wash and so on, and. But I may have gone too far in that direction. So that's a good point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. So I'm an econ major. I'm not very familiar with any of the jargon in philosophy.
We all envy you.
Yeah. But
oh, you said econ. Well, maybe
yeah. But I was under the impression that the kind of unifying factor between philosophy and the sciences, and why I could very much assume that if somebody told me that they were an anti-moral realist, but they believe that mathematics is like some kind of objective truth, I would say that's probably inherently incorrect because of the direct link that philosophy and math both have just in their origin. So my question is, like, isn't the very beginning of philosophy, and let's say something like mathematics, which is, we would, count to be a science, that origin basically means it necessitates their similarity, because like in mathematics, as soon as we head into second order logic, it's like, okay, well, now you're just defining axioms and postulates, and from there you're making proofs. And some of them happen to be objective because physics and engineering proves that these things work in real life, right? And then in philosophy, it's like, well, now we're going to start with these assumptions we're making, and then from there build a constructive argument. But whether or not we're discussing the meta of that argument, well, that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
So couldn't we just look at like the very beginning of both both fields, I suppose, and say like, yeah, because we both are having to make assumptions or axioms, they inherently are similar in that aspect? Yeah.
I almost think I understood that, which means I have to pretend to answer it. So, I mean, relating to the previous question, I mean, if both math and morality, there's a question, it's maybe more gripping in the case of morality, about what, I mean, everybody agrees that there's like better and worse answers to the questions, and then that both fields raise. And then there's a second issue of whether the betterness and worseness is to be conceived as the world being a certain way as opposed to another way, or, say, in the case of morality, some people say, well, no, it's really, and this is getting back to what you were saying, I mean, it's really, there's better and worse procedures. There's proper ways to reach decisions morally that aren't sort of happily conceived as ways that are better tracking what the moral facts are out there. Now, it's not as common in the case of math, but there's that view as well in math, that ultimately the real difference between good and bad mathematical theories, well, I mean, at least one important difference is, I mean, you can do math well or badly. It's a procedural difference. And then there's still a question why some mathematical theories that like caught on and like not any old random set of axioms that you would write down would catch on. Well, that might have something to do with which bodies of sort of procedures actually are useful in dealing with the world we find ourselves in. So like arithmetic is really good because you can move like huge numbers of steps in a given direction. I'm sure you've noticed that. That's why arithmetic is good. Whereas if we live in a world where motion was rotational, say, and after like 6 steps you're back where you started from, then this other variant of arithmetic, modular arithmetic, where once arithmetic mod 6, 2 plus 3 is still 5, but 2 plus 5 is 1. You go back to 1. Presumably that modular arithmetic is really important, but mostly because for the light it sheds on regular arithmetic. It's not like necessarily the thing that you directly apply. And so, one could take the view that in the case of morality and math both, it's really correct, incorrect is really like to be drawn at a procedural level. And then there's a further question, which procedures does it make sense for creatures like us to be applying given the situations we find ourselves in? That's not really an answer, but it's just to say that there are the same kinds of questions of whether to look for truth in mathematics as there are in morality and as there are in philosophy. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. So the talk is called the demarcation problem for philosophy. But I'm wondering, does that mean then that we should think that other disciplines aren't doing this kind of pointing out where we're pinned thing, and that's how we've demarcated philosophy from other disciplines? Or is it that maybe when some problem arises in another discipline that sort of shows where you're pinned, that's when they're actually doing philosophy there? Or is it?
Well, that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, certainly philosophers haven't cornered the market on being pinned. People do get pinned in other fields, and there are parts of, I don't know anything about this myself. This time I really mean it, as opposed to the other times I said I didn't know about stuff. Like in physics, people get pinned in various ways. I think on the whole they tend not to sort of glory in it the way philosophers do, and maybe even rightly do. It's sort of like it's sort of like what the human condition is to a certain kind of literature, high-flown literature, getting in predicaments is to philosophers. Whereas physicists, they tend to think, well, we're going to have to deal with this at some point, but maybe we can sort of field it out to like that guy, some like super. I mean, there are to the very few physicists who actually care about those questions, but most physicists can safely ignore, whereas philosophers don't say, oh, that's too hard. Let's field it out to the guys who like to deal with the hard stuff. And we're going to continue with like whether it's better if people have enough to eat. That's So I don't think there's the same like love of predicaments, but I could be wrong.
So it seems that there's some question these days about whether it's helpful to gatekeep philosophy. And it also seems as though there are a lot of people in philosophy departments who aren't doing this. And I'm curious about whether you think that this is the only real philosophy and the rest of what we are doing, who aren't doing this, are not doing real philosophy.
Actually, there's a cancellation letter in the mail to people. I think everyone here will understand if I refuse to answer that. I definitely. I'm more like trying to find a there in a place where it once seemed like a particularly deep kind of philosophy was, I definitely don't want to gatekeep being ill-suited by nature to keeping anyone out of anything. So,
thanks so much for the interesting talk. I guess I take it one feature of William's distinction between the absolute or God's eye perspective and the parochial one that we just can't escape is supposed to be that the former is in some sense third personal and theoretical, while the latter is in some sense first personal and practical. And I guess I was wondering if those features of that contrast were important for your use of Williams, or if or if they weren't meant to be playing a role in the argument.
well, the pun that was sort of intended was this maybe relates to Hannah's question earlier. I mean, it's true that the absolute conception is often identified with, like, you know, as Thomas Nagel puts a related idea, the view from nowhere. But I mean, it's interesting that you still say the view. In other words, it's kind of like there's a kind of thing you're trying to get at that seems like it's naturally put perspectively, and you try to sort of make the perspective less and less idiosyncratic, but it's hard to completely cure yourself, to get it out of the picture entirely, which I thought was part of Williams's point, that there's something sort of ironically self-undermining about it. You could never complete this project of trying to clean up perspectives so they stop being perspectives, because But your real question was, is the kind of is the little bit the little kind of frog peering up from the bottom of the well or the mug or whatever the metaphor is that I'm seeing, like where maybe there's a place for old-fashioned deep philosophy to be. Is that always going to have a practical aspect? Is it like going to be like our trying to deal with a situation that arises for us? Maybe that's also related to another part of Hannah's question. Yeah, maybe the way I put it made it sound that way, but it would be practical understood in a very kind of embracing sense, where something counts as practical if the only ways we have of deciding what's really true in the world, which is like supposed to be like what contrasts with the practical question, nevertheless raise this sort of issue for us. So if you count kind of theoretical quandaries, so to speak, quandaries that attend our best efforts to figure out what the world is like, quandaries aside, so to speak, as practical, then maybe there always would be something practical left. But I don't know. Yeah.
Yes, please.
I haven't had a philosophy class in 60 years at Cal, so I don't understand a lot of what you said here today. But my impression is the purpose of philosophy is to try to come to some objective truth, as is the purpose of religion, science, or art. But it seems like philosophy just wallows in the intellectual mud so much that I would think a lot of philosophers would say, I'm sick of being in this mud, let me try religion, or let me try something. But those are so limited too. I mean, my question is, do you think humans can wake up? You know, do you think that's possible to any kind of objective reality?
Well, your question kind of has the form, isn't it everybody, when is everyone going to like go to the best place? Why are we all staying here? Well, we don't all agree what the best place is. I mean, everyone is like discomfort, feels discomfort with different aspects of the way we approach things. But it's not like, if we thought it was just like, oh my God, why am I wearing these shoes where the laces are tied together? That's my problem. I mean, if it was that, if it was a localized thing, you could fix it, and then the door would be open, and that would be one thing. But everyone's, doing their best to make sense of questions that matter to them the best way they know how. And if they were aware of a better place to all go together, they would do it. So, some parts of intellectual life are more frustrating than others, and philosophy certainly takes a good bit of blame for some of the frustration. But I don't really. Your question makes it sound as though it's like there's this unforced error that everybody's making, but I don't think there's an unforced error. I think,
Can I ask you something, maybe following up on that a little bit? That, you didn't say very much explicitly about the value of philosophy, but just to give a little bit of friction to the question. I teach a class with a physicist and a social psychologist, and it took me 2 or 3 times of doing this class to realize there was a big difference between what they were doing in their lectures and what I was doing in my lectures. Yeah. That in their lectures, they were typically saying, here's the area, and here's what we think is going on. Whereas in my lectures, I was never telling them, here's what's going on.
Yeah. I've heard that about your lectures.
Well, I may get a bit further deeper into this. But it seemed to me that what I was doing in my chats was saying, here's a puzzle, and what I want to do is to get each lecture, I want to get the puzzle sufficiently wedged into everybody's head that they can go away and think about it. And the theories, I tell them some theories, but really they're all very unconvincing, and I usually, I'll tell you what I think, but really nobody else is convinced by it. So the important thing is the puzzle. Yeah. That's the thing that seems valuable, getting it in your head, sharply articulated, so you can think about it. And there's something kind of puzzling about that, because on the one hand, you think, well, what's going to be valuable is the solution. Right. A puzzle isn't of any intrinsic importance. It's the solution that's the important thing. It's just instrumental to getting the solution. Yeah. But it doesn't feel like that to me in philosophy. It feels to me more like the value is in the puzzle. And there's something disturbing about that. And I just wish to do you have any free associations?
That was like one aspect of that's sort of like the evil twin of Berkeley philosophy, in the sense that as I was thinking of it, and that's what I've been like wrestling with all these years, that you don't want to just be like fetishizing puzzles and where they have nothing to recommend them beyond that. Oh, like people much smarter than you used to fetishize these same puzzles, and so I was trying to. I'm more attracted to the idea that maybe this is a bit related, but given that we kind of our nature have to be sort of operating with principles that their ecological niche, so to speak, is only so big. There's got to be debugging procedures. There's got to be things you got to learn how to do. You say, when that happens, when you get cornered like that, you stop like saying why again and again, or something like that. So there's this nice book by Dennett and somebody else, I can't remember, called Inside Jokes, that has the story about what humor is about. That kind of brings out like how many people commented on the affinity between humor and philosophy, and lots of philosophy can be funny, some even intendedly so. And their idea is like, well, you're operating with all these sort of like subpersonal, like fast and dirty mechanisms, but those are going to misfire a lot of the time, and you don't want to wait till the last possible minute. You want to sort of like set up these artificial situations where things that you're spontaneously inclined to think, you catch yourself in the act of thinking of them, and you think, oh, that's funny. That's a weird thing. Like, I mean, I find it funny like how I keep on wondering whether the coin would have come up heads, even if I know that there's no nothing there to really be wondering about. And so I kind of think the one value philosophy can have is kind of, it can have like an apologetic value in that it tells you, you don't need to apologize for like trying to hew to certain principles if the replacement principles would actually, if life goes better, if you try to hew to these unmeetable principles than if you like really do hew to these like weaker principles that are like more consistent or you know, so I mean, I think, so there's this sort of apologetic aspect where you say, you know, you can look yourself in the mirror and say, you know, this is actually okay that you're using fallible procedures, and then a more positive part of philosophy would be, you know, to develop like a bunch of tools for how to deal with and there's a slapstick aspect to philosophy where you find yourself like out on a ledge. You think, oh my God, I followed all the rules and it's sort of it's a way of leading yourself back in off the ledge. That reminds me of this philosophically interesting joke. I think I don't know but it has to do with the ledge. It says, you know, I was walking my dog last night around the building, like on the 7th floor, along the ledge, and he says, you know, some people are afraid of heights. It's not me. I'm afraid of wits.
Absolutely the last call. Any? Be quick.
There's certain subject matter in philosophy where if you asked anybody, they would say that this is like philosophy, yes. For example, like what is justice? So you ask someone, is this philosophy? They would say, yes, it is philosophy. If you ask them, oh, is the distinguishing belief versus knowledge, is this philosophy? They would say, yes. And so the natural thing to ask is, well, why do we say yes to both of these subject matter, right? And the natural thing to do is to construct some kind of system as to distinguishing what is philosophy versus not philosophy. But my thought is that, is it possible that these are just kind of atoms, like, you know, just, and by atom I mean like it's a statement where you just say yes, and there's no reason for why you say yes. This is coming from the idea of, say, like Michael Huemer under the banner of ethical intuitionism, right? There's certain things that you say are moral statements or just morally good statements.
Yeah, right. Well, I mentioned the paradox of inquiry briefly. You know, if you didn't already, in this context, if you didn't already know what philosophy was, then you wouldn't even understand the question supposedly being posed when you say, well, what's philosophy or what's a philosophical problem? And one answer that's been given, and maybe it's a bit like what Michael Huemer says, is that, well, you might have like recognitional ability with respect to certain things, and you're wondering what the deeper principle is. You know, you can say, look, I'm like, so most of us are, you know, very few people will say, I wish I could tell the difference between good jokes and bad jokes. It just really eludes me. People are very, like, Descartes says somewhere, he says, you know, common sense must be of all things the most equally distributed, since everyone is so well satisfied with their own share. And so people kind of think they can tell what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. People think they can tell like what's a philosophical question and what isn't. You might grant them that competence. Why wouldn't you? There's a fair amount of non-collusive agreement on the topic. It's not like you constantly have to like browbeat people. Say, stop calling that philosophy. I mean, one of the things that Sally spends a lot of time doing is trying to get people to stop saying that's not philosophy. She even tried to stop me, knowing that it's hopeless. So it could be that, you know, the answer to your question is people know the difference in the sense that they can recognize the difference, and then it could be that they're wondering what they're really picking up on. Is it just like, you know, people can recognize the difference between what's cool and what isn't cool in a certain like high school, And probably you're not wondering, let's get a big grant so we can figure out what they're really picking up on at that high school when they call things cool or not cool. And so there's a bit of a bet here. People, there's these things you recognize as philosophical questions, and then there's this bet. Hopefully it isn't all just a complete cultural artifact that's completely path dependent, like a bunch of people, like Aristotle asked a bunch of questions. Some of them end up being good. They were taken over by scientists. Some of them we just can't give up on, and that's what we're, hopefully that isn't it, but maybe, that could turn out to be it. Yeah.
Okay, well, that was a thrilling talk, so thank you, and for a fascinating and generous discussion. Thank you.